Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the Inris Files. We are live, and it did occur to me it would be funny to wait a couple minutes before starting the live stream, but that would only be a joke on the people who would show up for the live stream. So might be just as well to show up on time for the people who actually show up live, because those of you who watch it later won't know that there was a delay before we started. As you might be able to tell, I'm talking about today is April Fool's. This is April Fool's 2026, and I'm continuing the conversation that I started in the last live stream, talking about practical jokes. And I think what's within bounds and what's out of bounds and all that. I have heard some people say that the problem with practical jokes is that they always ultimately end up punishing somebody. And I don't think that's true. I think that it depends on how it is crafted. If it's crafted at all. Sometimes practical jokes are just opportunities that spring up and you go ahead and you take advantage of them because they're there. I want to give a couple of examples of that where opportunity presents itself and I take advantage of it and it's just funny, but nobody is actually in any way diminished as a result of the joke. As I've mentioned once or twice, and I'm trying not to belabor the point, but I did used to work in radio. One of the things about working in radio is that you do, first of all, music companies are sending you music all the time. And so, and they always send more copies of the music than are necessary for you to have at the station. I don't know how that works now in the digital age, but before the digital age, they would send us records. They would send us CDs. They would send us CD singles. Sometimes they would send us entire albums. And I know the reason why. They would send the extra copies in the hopes that somebody at the station would end up taking one of those copies home, listen to the music, discover, oh, there's something on there that they really, really like. And then they would prevail upon the music director to add something to the playlist. This worked, by the way. I mean, it's an effective strategy. There were several times where the music director would say, hey, Inris, you'll like this. You should give it a try. And that's how I discovered bands like Voice of the Beehive, which became a perennial favorite of mine. But that's also how I discovered the Mark Knopfler's soundtrack to The Princess Bride, a movie that I would not have seen when I saw it if it weren't for the fact that the soundtrack music was so good. Of course, the movie itself is excellent. But there were other assets that the radio station would come into that made sense for members of the radio station to end up with copies of. Some of these kind of have a quasi-legal status. For example, we had extra copies of sound effects libraries. And because I was somebody who did a lot of commercial production and also production for a comedy radio show that we hosted, I ended up with one of the extra sets of the sound effects libraries on compact disc. These libraries were essentially, they were kind of expensive for the stations to acquire, but part of what you were buying was the royalty freeness of it all, so that you could use these sound effects and play them over the air, and you owned the rights to, or you owned the license to be able to include it in any of the material that you played over the air. Of course, these days, I realize with everything being digital and a lot of people not recognizing what intellectual property rights are all about, everything's kind of hazy and fast and loose with that. However, the station had paid for a hefty fee in order to be able to use these sound effects in any commercials that we produced, any skits or sketches, anything like that. And I ended up with a copy of the a legit copy of the of the library. These sound effects libraries, if you ever watch a movie and you hear the sound of an airplane careening quickly toward the ground, if you hear the sound of cattle lowing in the fields of the farm, you hear a car skid and crash, you'll often notice that that sounds an awful lot like what you typically hear when that sort of thing happens. And that's because there are a few libraries that are being used over and over and over again throughout the industry. And in fact, there's one that became famous. It's called the Wilhelm Scream. It's a German name, so it's spelled with a W, but it's pronounced as if it were a V. And if you haven't, you should look up on YouTube or your streaming platform of choice, the Wilhelm Scream. There are like 6 screams that were recorded of a man in pain, and number 4, pardon me, number 4 and number 5, I think, are the 2 that are used throughout all of the movies, to the point where once you have heard it in rapid succession and seen it in a bunch of different scenes from a bunch of different movies, you will never see another movie again that uses the Wilhelm scream without noticing that's the Wilhelm scream. The same is true for the sound of a car skidding and crashing. Why do I tell you this? When I was working at the radio station, I was also wrapping up my college career, and I was renting an apartment with a couple of other college seniors in a series of a row of townhouses that was similarly occupied mostly by juniors and seniors at one of the 2 major universities in the town. We lived in the valley right between the 2 major campuses, and so either way, you would have to go uphill in order to get to the campuses, and it was kind of funny to talk about how you had to go uphill both ways. But anyway, uh, during the summer, or I should say, as spring was coming into full bloom and the weather was nice and warm compared to what it had been, we end up in a situation where uh, it's it's beautiful enough to leave the windows open, let fresh air waft through the rooms, and uh, and it occurred to me, I don't even know why or how. This is not something I saw anybody else do, but I just happened to be looking at my sound effects CDs, and I thought, given where our row of townhouses was situated, we're in a valley alongside what is essentially a large creek. There are no roads between us and the creek, and there are no roads immediately on the other side of the creek. There's just the access paved driveway that you can drive along in order to get to any of the row houses. And and I had this sound effects CD, or well, the CDs, and I had a very nice sound system, which again, working in radio, et cetera, et cetera. This is back in the day, by the way, when if you had a nice set of speakers, they were huge. So I lifted the speakers up and I put them in the windowsills facing out. And my room was on the 2nd floor facing where the driveway was, where cars would pull in order to get to the townhouses. Again, don't know why this idea occurred to me, but it was such a beautiful day, and you never heard traffic because we weren't really on a road per se. And I took the CD that had the sound effect of a car screeching and crashing. and I put it into my CD player, and everything was hooked up and wired up, and the speakers were facing out. And I cranked that stereo louder than I had ever cranked it before, and I pressed play on the sound effect. And it was stunning how loud and how realistic that sound was. I would play it for you now, except the sound cancellation on this microphone is so good, it won't play something that I have on a speaker here. Maybe I'll add it later in editing, but just to hear the sound of a car rushing up and then the skids, the tires locking up, and you hear the skid, this long skid, and it's like any movie you've ever seen before. And then you hear the crash, and the crash, because I had it so loud, you could hear things bouncing off the car, like the hubcaps or whatever. And I realized this is just sound effects. It's supposed to sound like that's what's happening. I know they didn't really crash a car to produce the effect, but it was a very convincing effect. I did it just because I thought it would be hilarious. What I didn't realize was, I had housemates throughout the house. There was one in the back on the second floor where I was. There was one, downstairs, on the first floor in the living room, which was wide open space. The first floor was wide open space, and then the floor below that, we had, a couple of other bedrooms, and we had somebody in there. And there were people on each floor of the townhouse, and all of a sudden I hear, "Did you hear that?" And somebody comes rushing forward and to look out the windows to see what's what. In the meantime, as soon as I started hearing other people react, I took the speakers out of the windows, and then I heard people, in the townhouses all up and down the row saying, "What happened? What happened?" And everybody's trying to figure out what happened, not realizing or not recognizing in the moment we don't have a road there. There's no way a car could work up that kind of speed. It really was, it was a moment. And again, no cars were injured in the course of this particular practical joke. I I don't know. I think the thing about humor as a general rule is we tend to find things funny either because of recognition or incongruity. And this was a case of incongruity. It wouldn't have been as funny if I had done this on the city streets of like when I was in grad school in Philadelphia, and if I had played this out of the window above one of the busiest streets in West Philadelphia, it would have gotten some people going like, "What?" Would not have been as incongruous as it was in this particular case. And anyway, so I throw this out there as an example of a practical joke that everybody can kind of, once they recognize, wait a minute, there's no street here. There's no way a car could be doing this. Nobody nobody feels like they were deliberately being made fun of or anything along those lines. That said, I have participated in and I've been on the receiving end of some practical jokes where, yeah, all right. Yeah, there are either lessons being taught or the joke does actually have to have a person who is on the receiving end of the joke, and you just hope that that person is a good sport about it. Um, for example, one time when I was on the air reading the morning news. Oh, and this is interesting because I just thought about this a couple of months ago. This particular incident occurred to me, and I remember the guy who was the DJ, and I remember who the sports guy was, and it was what I remember was the DJ was the music director or the program director actually, who's above the music director, the sports director, and I was the news director, right? So we have the three people who have the most control over what goes over the air at the radio station at the time. And then So this thought, it occurred to me for the first time in years, just a couple of months ago, and within a week or two, I got a message from a friend of mine who had been a morning DJ at the station as well, and she said, "Hey, I've got this air check tape. I'm going through my old tapes and I'm digitizing them and I'm listening to them, and this is from one of the shifts that where you and I and the sports director were doing the morning shift, and I don't know, I don't remember what was happening, but it was obviously they were doing something in the window in front of you while you were trying to read the news about a lunar eclipse." So I misremembered who the DJ was. It wasn't the program director. It was this woman. And the thing about her is she has one of the most wickedest senses of humor that you could imagine. And I can totally, once my memory was corrected by listening to the audio evidence, I realized, yeah, she's exactly the kind of person that this would happen on her shift because she would encourage it to happen. But I was reading news stories about a lunar eclipse, and on one occasion, there was the question, "Oh, where are you going to be? Where are you going to go for the lunar eclipse?" And this was early on with me getting comfortable improvising. Um, but I managed it and it was fine. I know I've told a story earlier where I was thinking about the lunar eclipse thing. There was something else that had tripped me up much worse than that before this. At this point, I was much more comfortable. I'd been doing mornings, but it was still something where improvising was still sort of odd for me. And the sportscaster and the DJ, the jock, were having just a fantastic time, yucking it up and just enjoying the music and all that. This was a summertime shift, and everything is a little more relaxed during summertime in a college town. So when I the second or third time I was reading the story about the lunar eclipse, there started to be I can see through the window, I can see the DJ, I can see the sportscaster. I'm in a soundproof booth, but there's this big plexiglass window between me and them. And the sports director kind of stands up and he stands in front of me and he's facing the jock, but you can see him kind of wiggling his butt in front of me, which was funny, and it was all I could do to keep from completely cracking up on the air. And then a couple of puns were made with the jock and with me and with the sportscaster, about getting a preview of a lunar eclipse. Um, for those of you who English isn't necessarily your first language, there's a phrase in the English language called mooning, and mooning refers to showing your derriere in front of other people. So that's why these puns were happening, because he's wearing his pants and all that, but he's wiggling his butt in front of me, and that was the connection that was kind of making it really hard for me to concentrate until the next time when I was reading this, and you could tell they had talked about this, or at least this is how I remember it. When she sent me the audio recordings of this shift, she says she doesn't remember exactly what happened, and so it's possible all of our memories are a little off about this. But I did listen to it, and I do remember that at one point, he actually did drop trow and give me a preview of the moon. Uh, Not what I was expecting that particular morning, but again, everybody's relaxed and having a good time, and I was able to laugh it off without completely losing my mind in terms of keeping my stature as a serious news professional. Again, this is a case of somebody trying to make me laugh on air. succeeding. But that's a sort of practical joke where, again, there's no real victims per se, unless you're traumatized by images of human anatomy. Um, but again, this is one of those things that I throw out there as an example of what I consider to be a well-intentioned and well-executed practical joke. Um, the thing about practical jokes, and this is a little bit of a tip of things that I've learned over time. The thing about practical jokes is they're like magic tricks. The person who is playing the joke knows what the setup is, knows what the execution looks like, and knows what the environment is looking like, and can at any time decide to pull back and not execute because the conditions aren't right. The magician is aware of where everything is set up and how it's set up, and then the magician can kind of go with the flow if the person that they're performing a magic trick for doesn't respond in the way they expect. They can either pull it off using another method, or they can even fail to pursue that magic trick to its logical conclusion and move on to a different one, and nobody knows that he or she was starting to set up one and then abandon it to go on to another. The same is absolutely true for practical jokes. And as with magicians, a lot of the practical jokes arise from things that the performer picks up over time and files away in the back of their mind of, oh, this is something that elicits a response that isn't necessarily what you would immediately expect. And you just sort of file that information away. So I'm going to tell you a story about using technology to pull off a practical joke. At this particular point in time in history, telephones tended to be connected via wires to the system. And so you would have wires that would run up to an outlet in your room. And then in the room, you could plug into the outlet a cable that ran to your phone. The phone was corded, and then it would have a handset that was connected to the base with a cord. And we didn't have the wireless stuff and all that. And this is back in my day. I'm just telling you, this is what the technology was at the time. And something else that was common at this particular point in time. So keep in mind, I'm Generation X. We had answering machines as opposed to voicemail systems. The university had a rather advanced phone system that, in addition to the normal, you can call somebody, and then if they're on the other line, if they are talking to somebody else, you get a busy signal. But you could also hit a number sequence like *72 and then hang up. I don't remember the exact numbers. And then when they got off the call, your phone would ring, and it would ring with a different ring tone instead of the steady on, off. You would get ring, 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 pause, ring, 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 pause. And that would tell you that if you were to pick up the phone, you are going to get connected to the person who just hung up, who you were trying to reach earlier. There was also, now I do remember this number absolutely is correct, is *69. If somebody called you and you missed the call, or somebody else picked up the call and then hung up, and then you wanted to call back, you could pick up the phone, dial *69, and it would call back the number that had called you. This was sometimes called return call. Uh, if you ever listen to music by REM, they have a song called Star 69 on one of their albums. That's what it's referring to. It's referring to that ability to call back somebody who had tried to reach out to you. And then there were others that again could put people on hold. You could set up the ability to talk to two people at the same time. This was called a conference call. Uh, and we had answering machines. Now, the thing about the answering machine is it was something that you would the phone would plug into the answering machine, and then the answering machine would plug into the outlet. So it came between the phone and the system. And if nobody answered the phone, the answering machine detects the signal for the ring coming through it. And if it keeps ringing, that means nobody picked up the phone. And after a predetermined number of rings, it would pick up the line, and then it would play an outgoing message, usually recorded on something like a cassette tape. It would play the outgoing message, and then it would play a beep, and then the person who was calling had the opportunity to leave a message that would be recorded on a different cassette, or it could even be on that cassette. It would the tape system would forward the tape to the end of the last recorded message, and so the person who was calling would have to wait longer before they get the beep before they could start leaving their message. So it was very common for people to say, "Hello, you've reached so and so's house or so and so's number. I can't take the call right now. Please leave a message after the beep." You had to give those instructions because answering machines were kind of relatively new. They were only, 5 or so years old by the time I was in college, and the technology was advancing all the time. But whenever the technology is new, you give instructions on how to do things. So again, if you're ever watching a movie from that era, you you'll hear that leave a message after the beep. These days, as I record this in 2026, people very rarely leave outgoing messages, and in fact, my children's generation, they tend not to even make phone calls in the first place. They just rely upon texting. But it was common in these days to record outgoing messages, often with more information than just you've reached this person's number or you've reached this number. You would usually try to inject a little bit of personality into it as well. Certainly, my generation would. I don't know so much about that being the case for my parents. So, so anyway, and somebody's typing in the the chat section here about there was a TV show from the 70s called The Rockford Files, and that was something that you would hear regularly as part of the show. I didn't remember that was something that went all the way back to the 70s. The time period I'm talking about right now is the mid 1980s. So I guess it went back more than 5 years, which happens. So anyway, there was an occasion where on my outgoing message, what I did was I simulated as if I had actually picked up the phone from the call and then pretended that I wasn't there and that they were on the answering machine. They were on the answering machine, but I was pretending to be pretending that they were on the answering machine. So I said, "Hello, you've reached Inris and Steve. We're not here right now." And then, or no, that's what you would normally expect to hear. But instead, what I recorded was, "Hello, oh, it's you. You have reached Inris and Steve. Please leave a message after the beep." My roommate Steve was in the room at the time, and you could hear him in the background saying, "He's lying, he's lying." And then I was saying, "All right, which button do I hit to make it sound like a beep?" And then that was the end of the outgoing message. A friend of mine came over to my dormitory and wanted to be buzzed up, and so he called my number. I wasn't in the room at the time, so my answering machine picked it up and said, "Hello," and then he said, "Hey, Alan, it's me." "Oh, it's you. Um, Steve and I aren't here right now, but leave a message after the beep. He's lying. He's lying. Oh, what number do I hit? And then he gets the beep. Inris, I know you're there. Please buzz me in. I have something I really need to talk to you about. Ugh. And then he hangs up. Then he calls back and he gets the same message. And then he begins to realize that the outgoing message has tricked him into thinking that I am there when I'm not. And much hilarity ensued. Haha, I tricked him. Isn't that funny? This led to a joke that was 5 years in the payoff that he played on me. He never forgot about this particular time that he really wanted to get into my my dormitory, but I wasn't there to let him in, so he had to call somebody else to let him in. But man, he remembered that I got him with this outgoing message. So years later, when I was in grad school, I had gone out to do something and then I'd come back and there was a message on my answering machine and it was from him. And he at the time was living in California. I was living in Philadelphia. And he said, "Hey, Inris, I'm at the Philadelphia International Airport. I'm only here for a few hours. But I just wanted to see if you'd be able to get together while I'm in, because I'm here for a few hours. I'd rather spend the time hanging out with you than hanging out at the airport." And so I get that message. And then I get another message. So then the next message is, "Hey, it's me again. And I decided to take the risk that you would be there. So I went ahead and I got a cab and I'm waiting for you in the lobby right now of your dormitory. And hopefully I'll see you soon." And then he hung up. And I'm like, "Oh my goodness, Ted is here. But wait a minute, he wasn't in the lobby when I came in. I must have missed him." And so I run downstairs. He's nowhere to be seen in the lobby. This is before the days of cell phones. So it's not like I could just pick up my cell phone and say, "Hey Ted, I'm back." He had to use a coiled line, right? A landline in order to reach me. And he had gotten my answering machine. So now I'm kind of frantic. I'm like, how do I get in touch with him? And how long is he in town before he has to return to the airport and fly back to wherever he's flying to? And I think it might have taken me 20 minutes or a half an hour before I realized, wait a minute, because this is the kind of guy who would play practical jokes. And he played several on me over the years. But I had his phone number in California and I called it and he answered the phone and he said, "Hello, Inris," because he was expecting my call. And yes, he was still in California pretending that he was in the Philadelphia International Airport and wanted to see me. And he had called for whatever reason, but since I wasn't there, he decided to have fun with my answering machine. This was a joke that had been waiting for a while. He was waiting for the right moment to play it. And it was absolutely in response to that one time. He even said as much when we were talking about it. "You remember that time when I called your answering machine, but I thought you were really there?" Fun with phones. However, if you are really clever about answering machines or technology in general, sometimes you'll put together combinations of things that wouldn't have occurred to you otherwise. And I know that there are people who could be listening to me tell the story right now who, if you're Generation Xers, or maybe even not, maybe you are younger, but you still have an outgoing message on your phone where you decide to put something in it with a little personality and you decide to prank the person who's calling. I know that's not as common these days, but if you're a little bit older, you probably recognize and you're like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, I get it. Yeah, I did the same sort of thing when I was when I had an answering machine." However, because the university had a more advanced phone system than what my parents had when I was at home. Um, we had commands that were available to us that we didn't know about, like this one that I'd mentioned before. And again, I don't remember, was it *74 or *72? It was somewhere in the sevens, the 70s. But you could press this combination if you had dialed a number and you had gotten a busy signal. And then what would happen is the other person hangs up, and then once their line is free, your phone rings, and then you would pick it up, and then it would call them back as if you had just dialed it. And again, this is one of those things, I don't know how I made the connection, but it occurred to me to wonder if I call somebody who's on the other line and then I hang up and then I leave the room and then they hang up their call, what happens with my answering machine when it gets that different ring pattern? Because it doesn't just go ring, ring. It goes ring, 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 ring. Would it detect that as a ring, or would it ignore it because it is different from the usual pulse that it tends to get? So this thought had occurred to me, and then I decided to put it to the test. We had the dormitory I was living in at the time had a suite system where there were 4 rooms, 2 singles and 2 doubles that shared a common short hallway and then a common bathroom, right? So there'd be a shower, couple sinks, and then other bathroom facility things. So this way, you had a semi-private bathroom to take your shower in and that kind of thing. Um, and we had a guy who had a single in this little suite of ours. By the way, suite sounds really pretentious. I assure you, this was just normal, everyday dormitory stuff. In when I was living abroad in Moscow, they just referred to them as blocks, which I think was a much more accurate description than suite. But anyway, in our suite, we had a guy who had a single, so he didn't have to share his room with anybody, and he was kind of fussy. And he was on the phone all the time, talking to his girlfriend who was going to a college in a different town. And they were talking all the time and all the time. And it's not really that it was super irritating, but it was mildly irritating, just mildly. So he's on the phone talking to his girlfriend, and I decided I wonder what would happen if I were to call him, because I know he's on the other line. I'm gonna get a busy signal, and if I hit the *72 or whatever and then hang up, what's gonna happen? So I did that, and then, my my roommate and I, were like, "Oh, let's go play pinball at the student union." So we left. We lock our door on our way out. And then later on, come back like hours later, and the sweet mate Paul, he after we get in, he comes down and he knocks on the door. And it's like, "Hey, Paul, what's up?" "Inris, I think your answering machine called me earlier today." "Oh, I answering machines don't usually call people. They usually take calls." Anyway, he was completely baffled by why his phone rang after he hung up with his girlfriend. He picks up the phone and then he hears my outgoing message, whatever it was at the time. "Hey, you've reached Emerson Steve. Leave a message after the beep." And he's like, it's just the weirdest thing. I don't know why your answering machine would call me, and I didn't know what to do. And so anyway, he was very perplexed by this. And so, every once in a while, my answering machine would give him a call, just because these things happen. An innocuous joke, however, it's an example of the sort of thing where once once you Once you become aware of a sequence of events that's a little out of the ordinary, that can become a magic trick. That can become a practical joke. And you just sort of file that information away until an opportunity comes up and you take advantage of it. So I mentioned that. I don't know if you find these to be particularly hilarious. Nobody was ever injured as a result of any of our practical jokes. However, there was an occasion where I think maybe we did go a little far. Am I still broadcasting? I can't tell. Yep. It says live. I just looked at my control panel here. They've changed where the buttons are. How's that for a practical joke on your broadcaster here? Anyway, oh, and thank you in the chat for confirming that I am indeed still broadcasting. So, but that's that is hilarious because the button that used to be down there is now up there. Um, there was an occasion when I learned that in our dormitory, there's a trick to being able to open any of the rooms uh, anywhere in the building if you happen to know the trick. And I discovered it because I discovered somebody trying the trick during a break when there was nobody around. You kind of look out for yourself and for your neighbors when everybody else is away on the break. And this woman was going around and she was just trying this, and you don't normally live in this suite over here, so it's like, oh no 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 no, but I'm a friend of so and so's, and I just wanted to see because I heard that this was a thing that you could do, and I thought it would be kind of funny to go in and just leave a note in their room. And I'm like, oh, well, then she showed me the trick. I will not be describing the trick on this call because my guess is that a lot of the older dormitories still use the same uh, the same methodology for handing out keys today as they did decades ago, and I don't want to be responsible for somebody using this information for ill purposes. But if you knew the trick, you could get into you would have to do a little bit of social engineering, but you could get into anybody else's room with a little bit of planning. And this is the last one I'm going to mention today. Well, maybe the second last one. I had by the time of my sophomore year, I was still living in the same room. I had this roommate, Steve, and there were several of us who were still carryovers from freshman year, our first year in college. And there were also some new people because a lot of people after the first year went off to live off campus or live in a different dormitory on the campus. And Paul had remained, and Paul also had started to irritate a lot of the other suite mates. Again, I didn't really care. He didn't really bother me, but he had annoyed the others. And I happened to mention to my roommate, hey, I just learned this trick while everybody was away on break. And I explained it to him because he's absolutely as trustworthy as any partner in crime can be. And well, then another break came up, and on this particular occasion, I did leave. I went to visit my parents because I didn't see them as often as I probably should have. But my roommate, Steve, stayed on this occasion, and so did a few others. But Paul had also left. And armed with the information that I had given Steve, he and other people on our floor who were there for the break had hatched a plan. And the plan was Paul was very neat and organized and had everything just so. Everything was organized in a very specific fashion. If I had known the term at the time, I probably would have, as an amateur, guessed that he had some form of OCD, or maybe not. I don't know, but he didn't have a lot of clutter. Case in point, he didn't have a lot of clutter, and what what they decided to do was a harmless prank, but a real prank nonetheless. While everybody was gone, the few of them who were still there would remove everything from his room and put it in the suite that we had. There was a section that was too small for a room, but it was just barely big enough to hold like bicycles. And I think that's what it was actually intended for, was for bicycles. And so we'll call it an alcove for lack of a better term. When you would walk into the suite, the alcove was immediately off to the side, and you would almost never notice that it was there because we never used it for anything. They took all of the furniture out of his room and they put it in the alcove so that his room was completely empty. So that when he returned from break, he goes into his room and it is bare. I can't even imagine what his mental state was at that time, but I believe, if I remember how it was reported to me later, if I remember correctly, he kind of ended up yelling something like, "Guys," and they immediately fessed up. The joke had been executed, and they had given him this start. But then they're like, yeah, no, we'll put everything back exactly the way it was. And they did end up restoring his room exactly the way it was, because all that stuff was in the alcove. Paul just didn't notice it when he walked by it to go to his room. And it's something I think about. And it's something I even thought about at that time. When I had heard about this, I was like, I don't know. I don't know if that first of all, I think it's actually quite funny, but I also think that it might have been a little further than I might have gone. Uh, having his phone called by my answering machine is one thing, but having all of his stuff and making him think that his room was, I don't know, stolen or whatever, it was just a little bit further than I might have gone, but it was kind of funny. And he was kind of the sort of person who you were like, yeah, that's the kind of person you play that kind of prank on. Just as I was the kind of person you would play different pranks on, which I'm going to have to save for another live stream. It won't be right away, but I will tell you, because there have been some really funny pranks that have been played on me. But yeah, it kind of made me wonder if I made the right call in sharing that piece of information with my roommate. Uh, because it was just one of those things. But anyway, that was a I mentioned that one because it's an example of, I got some information and then I filed it away for potential use down the line. I had no intention to use it for criminal activity, but it just might be the sort of thing that could come in handy. Maybe it would have come in handy if it turned out one of my suite mates lost his key and couldn't get into his room, and we couldn't get the resident advisor to get the key to get him into his room. We could have gotten him in without having to go to heroic efforts. Or it could be used for the purpose it was used, which was to play this prank on Paul. But when you start thinking in that mode of a magician or a practical joker or whatever, you pay attention to your surroundings. You pay attention to whenever you learn something that is a little unusual, because that is something that could come in handy later. Um, so it's food for thought that I happen to throw out there. And I think that this actually leads up to, I've got about 10 minutes left before the top of the hour. And it leads to the funniest prank that I've ever seen played. And what happened was this